Thank you for all being here this morning, and hopefully this sermon will be helpful to us in some way. Especially as this morning as we begin, I'm very mindful of Brother Jim and his passing this weekend. Very thankful for all the hard work that him and Miss Peggy both did for this congregation. And very mindful of them, but certainly very thankful of what Brother Jim's getting to see right now. And so certainly mindful of them as we move on this morning, and thankful for the things that him and Miss Peggy both did for us. For the time that I have this morning, I want to talk about 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. In my mind, that these three books live together, and I call them the famine epistles. And the reason why I call them that is because it seems to be there was a famine going on in Jerusalem when these three books were written. And it seems that Paul mentions it in every one of these books during his third missionary journey. We know historically that there was a great famine that hit the Middle East for almost 10 full years during the time period that Paul would have been on his third missionary journey. And as this famine has hit, Paul is urging local churches to take up a collection and send it to the needy saints in Jerusalem. And that's what we'll be talking about this morning. And by the end, I think you'll see some of the main arguments that we can pull and learn from these three books when it talks about that collection. To kind of put it up on a map, just so we can visualize what's going on, this is a map of Paul's third missionary journey. And Paul's going to write these three letters while he's on his third missionary journey. Before I put some things up on the screen, I just want you to take note of something. The big words here are counties or provinces. And you have the word Asia, Macedonia, Achaia. And Paul is going to use these words in the readings we're about to do. They're the names of the counties. So we know about the city of Thessalonica, like the book Thessalonians was written to. We know about the city of Berea. We know about the city of Philippi, who Philippians was written to. But what's the name of the province that they all live in? They all live in Macedonia, right? Think of it like the state. Corinth, we know about Corinth, Corinthians. But what province do they live in? They live in Achaia, right? We know about Ephesus because of Ephesians. We know about Colossae because Colossians. What county do they live in or province? They live in Asia. So as we go forward, when Paul's talking about the Macedonian brethren, who is he talking about? He's talking about the Thessalonians, the Bereans, the Philippians, right? When he talks about Achaia, who is he talking about? He's talking about the Corinthians. So we kind of need to know that as we move forward. During the third missionary journey, as Paul is traveling down towards Corinth to turn around and go back home, he writes first 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. We get that at the end of 1 Corinthians. And he writes across the pond, right, across the Aegean Sea, and they receive 1 Corinthians. Then he travels up to Macedonia, and as he travels up to Macedonia, that's when he writes 2 Corinthians. And he gets to write that letter, and Titus sends it, and Titus goes with him. And then eventually Paul goes down to Corinth. And the belief is that from Corinth, Paul writes Romans. We get that from the very end of Romans when he says that he's staying in Gaius' house. Gaius is a name of a man we know to be in Corinth. And so probably, at least in my mind, this is how that story laid out. He wrote 1 Corinthians, he wrote 2 Corinthians, and then in Corinth he wrote Romans. After writing Romans, he turns around and goes back through Troas to go home and to deliver that support to the needy saints in Jerusalem. So now let's look at these passages, now that we know our counties and we know our provinces and we know our cities. I'm going to go backwards. Romans 15, he mentions the needy saints in Jerusalem. And I'm going to put all of our passages up on the screen just so we're all on the same page, but of course you're more than welcome to turn in your own Bible. Romans 15:25, Paul says, "But now I am going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints. For it pleased those from Macedonia," right? Philippians, Thessalonians, Bereans, and Achaia, the Corinthians, "to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem. It pleased them indeed, and they are in their debtors. For if the Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister to them in material things." And the thought that Paul's making to the Romans is he's saying, look, these are mostly Gentile churches, and these Gentile churches have had it in their heart to take up a contribution and seed it to the needy Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. Why? Well, because we have profited from the Jewish Christians. They're the ones that have taught us the word of God. They're the ones who the gospel was originally preached to. And now it's fitting that the Gentile Christians come to the Jewish Christians in their time of need. And so Romans 15 gives us a nice little summary of the mission and the purpose of what we're doing. Paul asked the Romans to pray with him that this gift would be accepted from these Gentile churches. Now let's go to 1 Corinthians. We're probably all very familiar with this passage. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have also given the orders to the churches of Galatia, that's another province, so you must also do. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me. When we read this passage, usually we go there to focus on verse 2. You know, we want to make the point that the churches take the collection on the first day of the week. That's what's been authorized. Paul doesn't want them to be rushing to take a collection when he gets there. He wants them to go ahead and be storing that money up so it can be sent to the needy saints in Jerusalem, just like the churches at Galatia already have. But what I want to do this morning, instead of focusing on verse 2, which we already know, I want to focus on verse 3. Paul says, and when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. And maybe, hopefully, they can go with me when I go. There was a responsibility here for the church at Corinth to appoint a man to bear that gift to the Jerusalem Christians. And that's what the apostles commanded be done in this situation. Now, that gets more explained when we get to 2 Corinthians. Now, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I know we're reading through these passages very fast. My plan is at the end, we're going to go back and we're going to explain them in order. 2 Corinthians verse 8, verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in the great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and even beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. Receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. The thought is here now is Paul's traveled around and now he's in Macedonia. And he's telling the Corinthians in his letter, hey, I'm in Macedonia and let me tell you something. These people are urgent about sending this gift to the needy saints in Jerusalem. And they're imploring us, please, let's go. We've got the gift. Let's go give the gift to the needy saints in Jerusalem. Paul says in their poverty, they're giving with liberality. And he says, and it's not just that they gave, but they gave beyond what they really should have given. And we all know brethren like that, don't we? We all know brethren that seem to just give a little bit more than they probably should. And that's who the Macedonians are, right? The grace of Jesus exists within them, the grace of God, and they give beyond what they should because they're so urgent to be a part of the fellowship of the ministering to the saints, right? They want to help these Christians in Jerusalem. We're going to say the word saints a lot. Being it's a Sunday morning, let me explain what that word means. The saints are those who are sanctified by Jesus, right? And maybe in a lot of religious cultures, we don't use that word often, or we use it for something different. But all the saints are Christians. That's all it is. These are members of the Lord's universal kingdom, his universal church. And so who is this support in this collection going to go to? It's going to go to the saints. It's going to go to Christians in Jerusalem. Those are the people in need, and those are the ones whom the church is going to take a collection to support. We do 2 Corinthians 8 a disservice when we say that this chapter is about generosity. It is about generosity, but that is an oversimplification about what this chapter is about. If we just said, 2 Corinthians 8, that's the generosity chapter, we have oversimplified to the extent of what this chapter is really about. Let's read the next paragraph, and I think we can give a better definition about what this chapter is all about than just generosity. They're going to be a part of this gift to the ministering of the saints because of verse 13. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there might be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Paul says, Corinthians, I'm not asking you to take up a collection so you lose your resources just for the sake of Jerusalem gaining your resources. He says, we're doing this so that you can supply their needs. So in turn, when you're in need, they can turn around and supply you. What 2 Corinthians 8 is about is not just about generosity. It's about generosity for the sake of the survival of God's kingdom on earth. And that's what we get in the rest of the chapter. It's not just about doing good for the sake of doing good. It's about doing good so Jesus' kingdom continues to exist on earth. That's what 2 Corinthians 8 is really about, and that's why we have this paragraph, right? That even fits with his quote in verse 15. Who is he quoting in verse 15? He who gathered much had little left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. He's quoting Moses about the bread of heaven, the manna, right? The bread of heaven, or the manna, is what fed God's people in the wilderness. Now, what is this passage about? It's about God's people being fed by God by his local churches, right? And that's why he uses this quotation. Exodus 16:18, and I got out of the NIV. I thought the NIV got it very good here. It says, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone gathered just as much as they needed. That they didn't try to have an overabundance. No one had too little. All of God's people got exactly what they needed, right? And what's the word that we would use to describe that? Everyone got exactly what they needed. What about that word? That there may be equality, right? This is how God has always fed his people. And now in a dire need situation, in a way, this is exactly how God's going to feed his people again, the saints. So let's talk about that word equality. And we're going to need to use all those passages we just read to kind of build our model here of what happened. I just obviously got up here the church at Corinth, the church at Philippi, the church at Jerusalem. And there's more churches involved. We know the churches of Galatia involved. There's much more churches in Macedonia than just Philippi involved. But there's a need here at the church of Jerusalem. The people aren't eating, right? They're in poverty. They're destitute. And so what happens is the church of Jerusalem is basically diminishing, right? And don't get me wrong. I know that we love these concepts in the U.S. especially, that goodwill just runs on love and hope. In the concepts of like, as long as we just love each other, everything will be okay. And I know there's some good principles we can take out of that. But let's just be frank. For us to survive, you're going to need a little bit more than love. What are you going to need? You're going to need to eat, right? You're going to need clean water. You're going to need a place to sleep. And if you don't have food and shelter, which Paul says if we just have that, then we'll be, right, satisfied. We'll be content. But you do need it, right? You do need food and shelter. If the Christians here at Gardendale did not have food and shelter, would we be able to do the things that we're doing for the Lord right now? I mean, if we're all starving to death, are we all going to be able just to come here and teach Bible class and be about trying to spread the gospel and things? No, what are we going to be consumed about? We're going to be consumed about my family's not eating. We've got to figure that out right now, right? Once we have food and shelter, then what is it much easier to do? Well, now it's much easier to do the work of the kingdom, right? I'm not concerned about food. I'm concerned about doing the work of the kingdom. Well, because the church at Jerusalem is in that situation, that's why it's become appropriate for the church at Corinth and the church of Philippi to send support to Jerusalem to take care of those necessities. And when those necessities have been met, well, now there's equality, right? Everyone can do the work in the kingdom that they're supposed to be doing because the church at Corinth, the church at Philippi have come to the rescue. And that, in its truest sense, is what Paul desires in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Well, if that's equality, then I feel like we need to say this. This would not be equality. What if the church at Corinth just decided that they weren't going to send help to the church at Jerusalem? And it seems like when you read 2 Corinthians 8, Paul's a little worried that that might actually happen. What if we just don't help? Well, then the church at Jerusalem will diminish, won't it? Because no one's coming to the rescue. And I know in a modern day world, we have things like FEMA, we have things like insurance. We're not as concerned about food production as we used to be. We produce enough food to feed the world 8 times over here in the U.S. But in their world, this is a serious issue. Their people will die. Church members will die. And when church members die, you don't have as many church members to do the work anymore, do you? This is a really sad situation. Is that equality? No, of course that's not equality. Because the church at Corinth and the church at Philippi in this fake scenario did not come to the rescue. Well, if that's not equality, well, the opposite is also not equality. What if this happened instead? What if a little bit later the church at Corinth also fell into a famine or an earthquake or a hurricane or what name you? And now they've become diminished and they don't have the basic necessities and they can't do the work of the kingdom. Who's going to come to the rescue now? Well, it's not going to be the church at Jerusalem, is it? They're down to 20 members. And the little collection they can take is not going to be enough to help the church at Corinth. Well, what has the church at Corinth done? Well, now because they didn't provide the lack of the church at Jerusalem, now the Jerusalem church can't turn around and help their lack. And this is when we've messed up verse 14. I'm going to read it again. But by an equality, that now the time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance may also supply your lack, that there may be equality, right? So going back to what I said is the definition or the meaning behind chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians, it's not just about generosity. It's about generosity for church survival. That's what it's about. And that's why it's exclusive to the saints. The church at Corinth is not taking up a collection just to help the everyday person in Jerusalem, are they? Paul's very specific. It's about the saints. Why is it about the saints exclusively? Because it's not about generosity. It's about generosity for the survival of God's church. That's why it's exclusive to the saints. And if we oversimplify this chapter, we miss it. And even further, if this happens later, if the church at Jerusalem diminishes and the church at Corinth diminishes, if something happens to Philippi, who's going to come to the rescue? Nobody. It's in our self-interest as church members to make sure that other church members' needs are met, right? That needy saints are taken care of. Very real-world situation. Many of the churches in Texas got destroyed in those hurricanes a few years back. Didn't they have hurricanes back to back? Boom, boom. And several of the members did not have homes anymore, did not have a place to stay, did not have a way to work, did not have a way to do anything. Could we have taken up a collection on the first day of the week and send that support to the needy saints in Texas? Yes, we could have. Now, number 2, would it have been in our own self-interest to do so? Yes, it would have. Because the next time tornadoes blow through Birmingham, guess who can come to the rescue if we met the needs of the saints in Texas? Well, then the saints in Texas could have helped the churches in Birmingham because it's about generosity for the survival of God's kingdom on earth. And certainly that's what I see here in this concept of equality. And hopefully that makes sense. And if you got questions, you're always more welcome to come talk to me, talk to Jason about these things. We love talking about the Bible with people. All right. This is also not equality. We've been doing the opposite, but let me just you know what I mean. I'm going to show you the opposite. Let's say that there's nothing wrong with the church at Jerusalem. There's not a famine going on. There is no need. But the church at Corinth and the church at Philippi just decide to go ahead and send their resources to church at Corinth just because. Well, what happens instead? What about this happening? Where now the church at Jerusalem just has an overabundance because all the local churches have sent support to them for no reason. What is this? That's not equality. And really, in looking at our history, you know what that is? That's a recipe for a denomination right there, where you've got one church begging another church for its own resources back, just so that they can do the work in their area. And now we have someone that's become overly powerful. That's not equality either, and that's not what Paul's talking about in 2 Corinthians 8. Let's read the rest of 2 Corinthians 8. Verse 16, Paul says, "But thanks be to God who put the same earnest care for you in the heart of Titus. For he not only accepted the exhortation, but being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord. And we have sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. And not only that, but who was also chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift, which is administered by us to the glory of the Lord himself, and to show your ready mind." Now, what Paul says here is, I'm thankful to God that Titus also feels earnestly about these things. And Titus has traveled to Corinth on his own accord just to check in on the brethren. Titus isn't traveling alone. He's also traveling with a man who is chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift, right? So there's another man traveling with Titus that has been chosen to carry the gift from the collection of the church to go to the needy saints in Jerusalem. Paul explains why this is the case in the next passage. Verse 20, "Avoiding this, that anyone should blame us in this lavish gift, which is administered by us, providing honorable things not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men." Paul's saying, I have to avoid this. I have to avoid taking the collection myself, lest someone suppose that this was my gift and not the church's gift. And that's why it's needful for them to choose someone to carry the gift for them. That's 1 Corinthians 16:3. And if you remember at the beginning of the sermon, I asked you to remember that verse. "And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem," right? Meaning, you cannot default and just give the money to Paul. You need to choose someone with a letter that's going to be the carrier of your gift to Jerusalem. We looked at the passages, but let's look at it visually again. The concept here is that they need to bear your gift, right? And that's what Paul tells them. You choose a man to bear your gift, lest anyone thinks it's our gift. Paul refuses for them to take up a collection and default and just hand it to Paul while he's on his way to Jerusalem. They know Paul's on his way to Jerusalem, but Paul says it's not honorable for him to take the money and him just to deliver it to the church at Jerusalem. Why does Paul say this is inappropriate? He says it's inappropriate because it's no longer the church's gift, it becomes his gift. And if we all just default and we all just give our resources to Paul and then Paul gives it to the elders of the church of Jerusalem, they're not going to say, "Oh, this is from Corinth." They're going to say, "Oh, this is from Paul." And that's not what Paul's desire is for it to be. Remember this again, 2 Corinthians 8, "Avoiding this, that anyone should blame us in this lavish gift was administered by us." Let me pull three things out of this little section. The first one is this. If we do it this way, instead of having a middleman like Paul, what are we protecting? Well, what we're protecting is the work of the church. That the gift remains Corinth's gift, right? If Corinth sends a man with the gift, with a letter that says, "Hey, this is Titus, we collected 3 talents of silver, and this is from the church at Corinth to give to the needy saints in Jerusalem." Well, whose gift is it when the Christians in Jerusalem receive it? They say, "Wow, this is from Corinth," right? But if they defaulted and gave it to Paul, well, then who would it be? It would be from Paul. And it's not the work of Paul here, it's the work of the church at Corinth. I'm trying to go backwards instead of forwards here. Number 2, especially looking at verse 21, providing honorable things not only in the sight of God, but also in the sight of men. Here's the second objective Paul has. Paul says that this situation, I gotta remember how we go. This situation is not honorable. It is not honorable in the sight of God or in the sight of men for Paul to be a middleman. Now, I don't feel like I need to explain why it's not honorable in the sight of men to have a middleman. Because frankly, what do we all think here about middlemen? You know, new car dealers, you think about that. A lot of us are trying to have to buy a car right now. The factory sells it for one price, but the dealership sells it for a different price, don't they? Why? Because middlemen are not are not honorable in the sight of men, right? Like, we understand that concept. We don't think of middlemen as being something good at all, that they're going to take a cut of what we worked for, right? So that explains that away. But let's talk about this part. It's not honorable in the sight of God for them to have a middleman in this situation. Does Paul not have authority as an apostle to take money from local churches? He does have authority to take money from local churches, especially as an apostle. Is there any issue here of Paul being trustworthy? Here's the most trustworthy brother that we have in the brotherhood, with the exception of Jesus. This apostle here, by the way, also has the most authority in the church, except for Jesus, with the other apostles, of course, as well. Is there an issue here about whether Paul's honorable or not? No, that's not the issue. The issue is the action is not honorable. And so this is my argument. If it is not honorable for the apostle Paul himself to be a middleman, then how could it be honorable for you or me to be a middleman? It would never be honorable for you or me to be a middleman. It would never be honorable for the local church to give its work to someone or something else. Why? Because Paul said it is not honorable, not only in the sight of God, but also in the sight of men. The work of the church needs to be done by the church. And even Paul felt that way with him being an apostle. Now, number 3. I want to make this very plain and real, because people need to be able to explain these things, because it's been brought up in the past and it will be brought up again in the future. So let me use a real-world example that has not happened to these organizations, but they have happened to organizations in the past. Many of you young people go to camp, and there's 4 different camps in Alabama that you can go to. And many of them are run by brethren. We love those brethren. They're good people. They're good brethren. And they run this organization, which they have the liberty to do so, right? A lot of you kids, when you go to these summer camps, you get taught the Bible a lot at those summer camps. And that's not a bad thing. Guess what? If I had a whole bunch of young people in my house, I'd probably make them sit down and I would teach them the Bible too. This is what Christians do. As Christians, you have the liberty to teach the Bible to anybody you want to at any time. There's no problem with that. But what would happen in the future? And these current organizations that a lot of y'all go to would not allow this, okay? To be clear, they wouldn't allow this. But in the future, what if someone suggested, you know what? All of our kids go to this summer camp and they get taught the Bible at this summer camp. That's a good thing. Why not we give some of the money that's been collected by the church to support that organization to teach our kids God's word? That would be a good thing. Let's do that. What would be the issue? The issue is that Paul said, bear your gift, right? The issue is Paul did not want to be a middleman to bear the gift of the church at Corinth. The church at Corinth was responsible for bearing its gift to the need. When a local church understands that there's a need for us to teach the young people the Bible, who's responsible for teaching our young people the Bible? We are, right? Now, it's fine that other people would do it. It's fine that other Christians would do it in other places. But ultimately, when it comes to the work of the church, who's responsible to do the work of the church? The church is. And that's why Paul says, bear your own gift, right? Now, again, that hasn't happened with a lot of these camps that y'all go to, but it has happened to other summer camps in years past in the state of Alabama, where other churches of Christ have had this conversation and they thought, well, no, that would be fine, right? They're not bearing their gift anymore. And finally, on that third point, at least from observation, what does it do to a local church when they start trying to get an organization to do their work? The church itself becomes weaker. Because you just use the example again of teaching the young people God. What do we gain from teaching the young people God? We become better teachers. We learn ourselves more about God. We're more involved in the young people's lives. And we know them, and we enjoy spending time with them. And we love teaching them about God, and we even get better at it as we go. We grow from doing the work of the church. But if we just surrender our resources for someone else to do the work of the church, what happens to us? We just become weaker and weaker and weaker. And next thing you know, we got full-grown adults that don't know the difference between 1 Corinthians and 1 Chronicles. And guess what? We all know people in the state of Alabama that don't know the difference between 1 Corinthians and 1 Chronicles, and they go to churches called Churches of Christ. Why? Because they've outsourced the work that the church was supposed to do. But Paul says, bear your gift, right? You choose a man. That man does the job. Let it be the gift of Corinth, not the gift of some middleman or some middle organization. Let's wrap this up with what Luke says about this event. In Acts 20, Paul is finishing up his third missionary journey, and he's on the way to Troas. Luke tells us who plans to rendezvous with him there. Verse 1 of Acts 20, after the uproar has ceased, Paul called the disciples to himself, embraced them, and departed to go to Macedonia. Now, when he had gone over that region and encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece, and he stayed 3 months. And when the Jews plotted against him as he was about to sail to Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. And Sopater of Berea accompanied him to Asia, also Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy and Tychicus and Trophimus of Asia. Why in the world is this passage sitting here? And there's no more about it. Luke doesn't give any further explanation. Why are all these men from different places traveling with Paul? Are these not the men chosen by the letters from the church to bear their gift to Jerusalem? When I look at all the evidence, that's the only thing I can conclude. And who is it? Sopater from the church at Berea, right? Aristarchus and Secundus, who are they from? They're from the church at Thessalonica. Gaius of Derbe, that's Galatia, right? This guy's a Galatian, and he's carrying the gift. Timothy, Tychicus, and Trophimus of Asia. And all I can figure is that's probably the church at Ephesus, the church at Colossae, and then plus one, maybe the church at Laodicea. And what have all these men done? They all have letters so the church can bear its gift to the needy saints in Jerusalem. Isn't that amazing? Well, maybe at least Andrew thinks that's amazing. Thank you for your close attention. And in my mind, that explains so much about what the work of the church is, and maybe even an easy way to explain it to others. If there's anyone here this morning that have yet to become part of the kingdom of God, I hope that if anything you got out of this sermon is that it's really good to be a part of the kingdom of God. Why? Because God provides for his people. That's why it's really good to be a member of the kingdom of God. He fed them manna in the wilderness, and he even makes sure that they eat here while they're here on this earth, right? The Lord doesn't only just provide food, but what else does he provide? He provides forgiveness of sins. And that's something I need a whole lot more than food. If there's anyone here that needs the forgiveness of God's sins, whether that be through obeying the gospel, or maybe you need the prayers of the saints, why don't you let us assist you if you'll come forward as we stand and sing.